I had not watched the Newsies musical since when the Pro Shot first came to Netflix way back in 2017, but I just happened to rewatch that same Pro Shot recently and realized that it had a lot to do with the stuff about labor unions we had been recently learning in my history class. So, for fun, here is a small presentation about labor unions as represented by Newsies, specifically the 2017 Broadway musical, not the movie or any other variant of the stage production. For the sake of time, I will be breaking down this video into chunks based off of the class standard currently displayed on the screen, those being the causes, course, and consequences of the labor movement in the late 19th and 20th centuries, using this specific strike to talk about that. I should also clarify that while the story is based on an actual strike from that time period, I won't be really going into the history of the actual strike, A, because there are some differences between the actual strike and the story, and B, because this is more to focus on strikes and labor unions in general, just using this story as a vessel to do so. Although the history of this strike in particular is also pretty interesting if you wish to look into it on your own.
What's his statement of purpose?
A reason for forming the union?
For those who are unfamiliar with Newsies, it is loosely based on the Newsboys strike of 1899, so we have a bunch of newspaper delivery boys forming a union and going on strike, which is about all of the background context you really need to understand the rest of the video. The way their work went was that they had to pay X amount of money to buy X amount of newspapers, and then the money they make primarily comes from the delivery sales. In theory, this is pretty fair. The newspaper companies get a certain amount of money from the newsboys, and then the newsboys get however much they're able to sell. However, it's made clear pretty early on that it's not at all like a glamorous life that these boys have.
Years of rotten jobs, stomped on by bosses. And when they finally broke them, they tossed them to the curb, just like yesterday's paper.
Most of the newsboys are too poor to have a stable living situation, especially since most of them are orphans, and how well off they are relies pretty heavily on if the headline is interesting or not.
The trolley strike, not again.
They are also regularly threatened by the risk of being admitted to a juvenile detention center called The Refuge, which has extremely poor living conditions and really only exists to financially benefit a businessman named Snyder.
The more kids he brings in, the more city pays him. Problem is, all that money goes right into his own pocket.
Other long-term causes to the strike include the fact that the newspaper company won't buy back any unsold newspapers.
So whatever I don't sell, you buy back, right?
Certainly! Oh, and every time you lose a tooth, I put a penny under your pillow.
And they just generally aren't really respected as workers because most of them are children or teenagers. The immediate cause to the strike, however, is that the price to buy the newspapers is raked up a lot because Joseph Pulitzer, who's in charge of the specific newspaper that this group delivers and generally has a lot of influence in that scene, wants more money.
I'll take 100. Be on my way.
100 will cost you 60.
I ain't paying no 60.
Understandably upset, the main character, Jack Kelly, remembers that the trolley workers have recently gone on strike, which he knows because it's been a headline in their paper for a while, and decides that he's going to form a labor union, making him the union leader alongside a newer newsboy named David, who knows more about the logistics of unions as he's clearly been able to get more of an education than Jack ever really did.
The Newsies of Lower Manhattan are officially on strike. Yeah! What's next?
We have our labor union and the causes for a strike, so now we can talk about the actual course of the strike. For time's sake, I won't talk about every single thing that happens in the play, but I will hit all of the key points in terms of the strike itself. Shortly after the Newsies declare that they are going on strike, they see a bunch of scabs, or people hired by the newspaper to replace them, come in and start their day of work. However, Jack explains to the scabs why they're going on strike and is able to convince them to join the strike.
I'm with you!
All is looking up until the strike begins to turn into more of a riot instigated largely by their employers and eventually also the police. Things continue to escalate until Crutchy, one of the strikers, is brutalized by that Snyder guy I mentioned earlier and dragged off to the refuge. He later sends a letter to Jack which gives us a bit more context as to what exactly the conditions of the refuge are.
But the food ain't so badly so far, 'cause so far they ain't brung us no food.
That all happens in a span of about 10 minutes, but it manages to address scabs, strikes escalating into riots, and the violence that comes along with said riots. Another thing that this story talks about a lot, like it's the crux of a lot of the story itself, is the power of the press. A journalist named Catherine gets the news strike on the front headline of the paper, which then prompts Pulitzer to blacklist any publication about the strike. He does this, to discourage the strike, but it ends up not really working because the newsboys over in Brooklyn decide to join in on the strike, which also prompts most of the Newsies from other major cities in New York to join, as they were mainly waiting on Brooklyn to give the go-ahead. More members, of course, means a stronger union, and because so much of Pulitzer's power comes from the news, all of the Newsies in New York going on strike begins to sorta, cause problems for him. Skipping ahead a bit more, the Newsies and the journalist from earlier find an out-of-commission but still working newsprinter and begin to mass-produce more papers about the strike, causing more of a fuss until eventually Governor Teddy Roosevelt hears about it and steps in.
Governor Roosevelt?
Joseph. What have you done now?
Ultimately, the strike itself did very little to affect the policies, but it did get the attention of those in power, which is what sparks real change and is often the case with any sort of labor strike.
Deal?
That's disgusting.
After some pressure from Roosevelt, prices on the newspapers are rolled back.
Give them the good news.
What good news?
That you've come to your senses and rolled back prices. Unless, of course, you want to invite a full state Senate investigation into your employment practices.
Pulitzer can't roll them back to where they were before, but it's a start. Jack then speaks to Pulitzer directly and convinces him to also begin buying back unsold newspapers. Another consequence of all this comes with the refuge. See, Jack has an affinity for art, and his journalist friend found a drawing he had made from a time when he was in the refuge and showed it to Teddy Roosevelt, who was repulsed by the conditions and promptly shut the whole operation down. Which means that Crutchy and all of the other people locked there got their freedom in the end, which, while not directly related to the news strike, almost definitely would not have happened otherwise, at least not that quickly.
Hey, Jack, look, it's Clutchy! Fellas, you miss me? Yeah!
Ultimately, the story does have a happy yet realistic ending to it, with the newsboys' rights getting expanded and their work conditions being made at least a little bit better, since they no longer have to worry about being locked up.
There's a lot of stuff you gotta have in order to be a union.
I am going to end this off with a quick recap of the concepts that were covered in this story because it's surprisingly educational when you peel back the overarching love story between Jack and the journalist, yes they end up together, and the extravagant dance numbers. A labor union is an organized group of workers, typically in a certain profession, formed to protect their rights as workers. The labor union here is the Newsies, and they are led by Jack Kelly and David Jacobs. In response to a greedy new work policy from Pulitzer, a monopolist who has a large amount of influence over the news circulation throughout the New York state, they go on strike, or stop working, but are soon replaced by scabs, or paid replacements. However, they convince the scabs to join the strike instead, and this adds to their growing numbers. A riot, or violent public disturbance, breaks out and results in multiple strikers getting hurt and one being arrested. They make front headlines, and in retaliation, Pulitzer, the monopolist, exercises his power to suppress more news circulation about the strike in hopes to make it stop. However, their numbers continue growing and the strike continues to escalate to the point where news generally isn't getting around that well. They even self-publish their own article and distribute it, which catches the attention of the government, which is what ends up causing real change. The location is also notable since it is an urbanized area when those were still really messy, and the cycle of poverty common in those areas plays a big part in the attitudes and conditions of a lot of the characters.
Everyone wants to come here.
New York's fine for those who got a big, strong door to lock it out.
Overall, if you like musicals and you like history, this is, a good one for that, and I would recommend watching it. I do believe that covers everything, though, so goodbye.